Lots is going to change in our world in the next 15, 20 years. Probably the most significant, and only because the demographic in this country, we have an aging population, and the baby boomers are all going to retire. And that's going to have a significant effect on all kinds of things, particularly the economy, because you take them out of the workforce, that's going to have an effect on it. You put them into, retirement, that kind of thing is going to change. How they spend their money is going to change. But also, just getting around. Chances are, because of that, it's going to have the probably one of the more significant effects on transportation right across the country, but certainly here in Ontario. Yeah, you're going to drive less. Maybe now that you've got the two cars, you only need the one, or whatever the case may be. But that's going to be one of them. And also, the popularity of electric vehicles is going to change a lot of that. We're also talking about ride sharing. We're talking about autonomous vehicles. It's going to have a significant effect on how we live in this country. But one of the fallouts will be the amount of revenue that we now get from fuel taxes that we're not going to get in the next 15, 20 years. And it'll be a significant dent in the provincial budget. The folks at the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario did a report on this, and it's just sort of stating the facts that by 2040, we're going to see a huge drop in that revenue particularly for Queen's Park. But, I suspect it would apply to the feds as well. How do we make that up? Andy Manahan is the executive director of the Alliance. Joins us this morning. How are you, Andy?
Morning, Dave. I'm doing well. If I have a little bit of a scratchy throat, I hope your listeners will bear with me.
We will. Just make sure you sneeze and cough into your elbow. You'll be fine. Wash your hands after this interview, and we're all good.
Fantastic. And I'll roll in the snow, too.
There you go. So the numbers are kind of startling when I look at the graph that is in the report that you guys have done. And I was saying before you came on the air, we were looking at the revenue change for gasoline alone is just from, I guess the peak would have been around 2004 when we were talking about the demand being something like 1,250 liters per capita, as opposed to you get down into 2040 and it's down around 550. So it's a huge drop over that, whatever it is, 25-year period. And that's a big dent in the provincial budget. All of a sudden, there's a hole there. What's the dollar value?
Well, we had asked Harry Kitchen to update a study he did for us in 2014, and that study looked out to the year 2035, and we were very surprised that there had been such a steep decline on per capita revenues going out to 2040, but even the 2013 timeline or 2014 timeline that went out to 2035 showed that on a per capita basis it was about $120 in revenue that the government was getting provincially, and now we're looking at below $90 per person. So that's a pretty significant drop. Now, what I should say is that we still have lots of immigration, and that people are moving into the Greater Toronto region and Ontario generally. So that does help in terms of the overall miles or kilometers that are driven, and it does keep revenue up for a little while. But the mega trends that you mentioned, it's not just the aging population, but younger people, millennials, are definitely driving less and using different types of mobility, such as ride sharing. I think you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Now, Ontario, of course, right now, with our current provincial government, doesn't seem to be too keen on electric vehicles, and they tore out some charging stations. But the bigger trends are elsewhere in the world that EVs are going to be taking off, and we all know that the big manufacturers out there are looking at EVs and connected vehicles. So there's a lot of change on the horizon.
Well, when we look at that, though, what's the alternative? And I mean, you guys have suggested a few, but it doesn't take long before we start to introduce the whole conversation of tolls into this discussion. That's almost a third rail for politicians. It
is. And you know what? Gas taxes seems to be a third rail as well, because it was introduced in Ontario in 1992 at 14.7 cents per liter, and it's remained unchanged for close to 3 decades. So politicians seem to be scared to raise gas taxes. Definitely, we do have the 407 ETR and the 407 East in the province, and that little chunk of highway on the QEW between Oakville and Burlington that has HOV and hot lanes. So that's one way to go, and we certainly think that with the emergence of EVs in the future, that direct road pricing is a fairer mechanism, because if you have an EV, you're not paying any gas taxes. So a user pay system where everyone who drives on the road is fairer, and it's kind of like electricity or water usage. You pay essentially for what you use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're all used to that. The other side of this is, and part of the infrastructure issues that we'll have to deal with, and it's already been stated, I think, is around the electricity, the electric vehicles, that is generating enough power to make sure that we've got, the capacity for electric vehicles. Another issue altogether, but again,
that's the issue, and then there's the battery issue and so forth. So
absolutely,
there's lots of issues tied to this. We recognize that. I guess what I should say with respect to a compromise position, because a few years ago, John Tory, you remember when he was wearing his short pants, went up to Queen's Park, and the then premier said, "No, I'm not going to let you toll the DVP and the Gardiner." And I think, here I go with my scratchy throat, I think part of the problem was that it wasn't very well thought through. When the councillors were debating it, it was, should it be $2, $3, or $4, and it was a flat fee basis.
Yep.
And most people that do tolling say that it should be based on time of day. So, for example, if you're traveling between midnight and 6 a.m. on the DVP, then you shouldn't be paying any toll, or it should be, a nickel or something really low. But during peak period, that's when you want to sort of bend the curve a little bit. And what the researchers, certainly in the U.S. and elsewhere, have found was that if you shave a little bit of peak travel to different times of the day, like let's say peak travel would be 7 to 8:30 in the morning on the DVP, if you can shift that either a little bit earlier or a little bit later, that has big impacts on congestion and traffic moving a little bit better. So there are environmental benefits as well. If you have cars that are stuck in traffic, you're putting a lot more out of your tailpipe.
Well, and here's the problem, though, and all of that makes imminent sense. It's all logical, and that's your problem, Andy. I mean, you start to dribble into logic in these discussions, and it goes nowhere politically.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the things that Tory should have recognized when he went up to Queen's Park was that he was saying things to antagonize drivers in the suburbs. He was saying, we're finally going to have you 905 drivers pay to use Toronto's roads. And he should have turned it on its head and said, you know what, you 905 drivers are finally going to benefit. And if we do a hot lane, and what that means is one of the 3 lanes is an HOV, where that would be a carpooling lane. But if you're a single occupant driver, you're allowed to drive in the HOV lane for a fee. And if he had said that this is going to benefit 905 drivers who are willing to pay a little bit more to get downtown, he probably would have had more support. And we certainly saw that around the Pan Am Games when there were 235 kilometers of HOV lanes. I remember listening to some talk shows, I'm not sure if it was yours or not, but there were drivers calling in saying, I would gladly pay to go in one of those HOV lanes in 2015 when the games were on.
Well, and I think that's, to some degree, is borne out with the 407. Now, the issue here is, and you make the point, if it's one lane on the highway, that's fine, because there are other options. But until you have a better transit or whatever, it's not like you can toll the entire Don Valley Parkway or the Gardiner. Exactly,
and that was one of the things that Wynne came back on. She said there wasn't enough choice with respect to public transit alternatives. But at least if you have 2 general purpose lanes that are still quote-unquote free, there's a little bit of a choice there. And it also minimizes the spillover effect. I remember even David Miller got this point when he was a mayor, saying that if we did put toll lanes on our Toronto highways, then people might go on to ulterior roads that are just going to get clogged and everything else.
Well, it's a good conversation starter, and some really interesting detail in here about the effect. We're going to have to face it sooner than later, and somebody's going to have the courage to sort of step up and manage this moving forward. Thanks for getting up with us this morning. We appreciate it, Andy.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Have a good day.
You too. Andy Manahan. He is the Executive Director at the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. Yeah, they're pretty much involved in all of just about everything that you see out there in terms of construction or that condo, your house, the roads, all that stuff. Water mains, sewers, you bet. So, yeah, they're just telling you, heads up, it's coming. Got to do something about it. Money's got to come from somewhere.
This Newstalk 1010 podcast was brought to you by PocketEmploymentLawyer.ca. Wrongfully dismissed, changes made to your job, lowballed on severance? Find out if you have a case before you call a lawyer. Go to PocketEmploymentLawyer.ca.